everybody. My name is Anthony Lavenda. I direct the Center for Climate Action and Sustainability here at Evergreen. I'm also a faculty member here, teach classes on climate policy. See a lot of familiar faces. Thank you all for coming. We have a really great talk today. As you know, this is the climate lecture series. It happens every week 3 and week 7 at this time in this place. So please come every week 3 and week 7 into this room and listen to our speakers. I just wanted to start with a quick acknowledgement. Evergreen's Olympia campus is located on the territories of the Medicine Creek Treaty Tribes, which include the Squaxin Island, the Nisqually, and the Puyallup tribes. The Squaxin Islands tribes' habitation of the land on and around the inlets of the Southern Salish Sea, including what is now the city of Olympia and the land that Evergreen is on right now, spans thousands of years. And if you want to learn more about the history of this place, there's lots of really great resources here at Evergreen, including the Native Cases collection online, as well as a number of works that have been done by students and faculty, many probably in this room, around Olympia's hidden histories that provide self-guided walking tours of downtown Olympia and really bring out that socio-natural history of this place. So please do learn more about it. A couple announcements just about this lecture series and the center. This marks the 3rd lecture of the year, right? So we are halfway through the lecture series. There'll be 3 more speakers. Our next speaker is Tyler McCreary on February 21st, which is in 4 weeks. And I encourage you to come learn about Tyler's work during that time too, which is more around pipeline resistance movements in Canada. So the other thing I wanted to mention about this, just a couple quick other points. Right after this, there's a climate cafe, which is going to be held for students and faculty over in the Social Justice Center, Evans Hall 2205. Usually there's coffee and a little light snacks and things like that, so please do go check it out if you want to continue the conversation we're having here. And then for Evergreen students, please do consider checking out the CCAS or Center for Climate Action and Sustainability internships. We have a number of exciting new internships that are posted on our website and on Handshake, so please do go check those out. I don't want to just talk about announcements for the center the whole time, but instead I want to introduce our speakers today, which we're really welcome here and we're really excited to have. Shannon Cram is an associate professor of environmental studies and science and technology studies at the University of Washington, Bothell, just up the road, and author of Unmaking the Bomb, Environmental Cleanup and the Politics of Impossibility. Many of you in the room are reading that right now, so looking forward to that discussion. Her research and writing considers the everyday life of environmental contamination with a particular focus on the body as a site of politics. She was a member of the Hanford Advisory Board for 10 years, which obviously is important context for this talk. Brittany Eichmann Lindley is an Alaskan indigenous islander of the Tlingit Nation with Tsimshian and Tahltan heritage. She is passionate about protecting the environment and advocating for indigenous people. Brittany is an alumna of Pacific Lutheran University, which we were chatting about just on the way here, the AHA International London, Seattle University School of Law, and the Native Action Network. She's a tribal court judge for the member tribes of the Northwest Intertribal Court Systems and a staff attorney for Hanford Challenge, a Seattle-based nonprofit that works to promote a safe and effective cleanup of a Hanford nuclear site. With Hanford Challenge, she works providing legal representation, including important topics that were on this morning, as well as things that we'll learn about in this lecture. So please welcome our very distinguished guest here. Thank you so much for being here.
Yake hatigudi. It is good you have come. My name is Brittany Kia'a Eichmann Lindley. I'm staff attorney with Hanford Challenge, and I'm here today with Shannon Cram, associate professor with UW, to discuss Unmaking the Bomb, nuclear waste and the politics of cleanup. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to start a discussion today by sharing a little bit about Hanford's history, a few of the cleanup challenges, and some of the things that Hanford Challenge does to ensure cleanup is done safely. Then I'll hand it off to Shannon to talk about her new book, Unmaking the Bomb, and her personal academic and professional experiences with Hanford. Finally, we will end with asking each other a couple questions and then open Q&A. So please write down any questions you have and save them for the end of our presentation. So let's start with the big questions. What is Hanford? In early 1943, the US government forced settlers and tribes to leave their homes so that they could build Hanford Nuclear Site in eastern Washington. It is marked here on the map in yellow, and for context, it's about half the size of the state of Rhode Island, or 586 square miles. Hanford was part of the Manhattan Project to produce plutonium used to create the world's first nuclear weapons. Thousands of workers showed up from across the United States to work on a top secret project. They didn't know what they were working on for many years. Secrecy and urgency led to shameful disposal practices, including discharging hazardous waste into the air, the ground, and the Columbia River. Plutonium production at Hanford created a lot of hazardous waste. Today, Hanford is the most contaminated place in the Western Hemisphere. If you've seen the Oppenheimer movie, you may recognize this scene. It was recurring. It shows Oppenheimer gradually collecting marbles. It is used to signify the United States' progress towards building the atomic bomb, with each marble representing the US's uranium and plutonium resources. The 74 tons of plutonium that was produced at Hanford represents about 2/3 of the US's supply and created Gadget, the first atomic bomb tested at the Trinity site in New Mexico; Fat Man, the atomic bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki, Japan; and billions of gallons of hazardous waste, of which 400 to 450 billion was dumped directly into the soil. In 1989, Hanford switched gears. Cleanup efforts began with the signed tri-party agreement between the US Department of Energy, Environmental Protection Agency, and Washington State. The agreement provides a legal framework for cleanup, agency regulation at the site, tribal consultation, and public involvement. The US Department of Energy operates Hanford, but it doesn't actually do any of the cleanup work. Instead, they hire private contractors to do all of the cleanup. This is the current list of primary contractors on the site, each of which also have several subcontractors that perform specialized projects for them. Under the tri-party agreement, cleanup was originally expected to take 30 years. However, we are now going on year 35, and Hanford cleanup is nowhere close to done. Current projections expect cleanup to require another 70 years to complete, billions of dollars in funding with amounts increasing annually, and technologies and engineering solutions that have never been used before. Even with the many challenges, much progress has been made at Hanford. For example, workers have buried and cocooned the 9 nuclear reactors along the Columbia River to allow radioactivity inside to naturally decay more over time, so that's more manageable, so the workers can go in and actually demolish those nuclear reactors. They've also treated over 23 billion gallons of contaminated groundwater. They stored 56 million gallons of radioactive waste in underground tank farms and transferred about 7.5 million of those gallons to new tanks, from the oldest tanks to double shell tanks. They've also monitored and tested and maintained sites with known contamination, such as underneath 324 building. You see arrows pointing to those areas on the map there. So this brings us to the challenge. There are many challenges at Hanford, from safety to funding to feasibility. But the biggest challenge is that a really bad day at Hanford could be a really bad day for 3 states, 3 federally recognized tribes, and beyond. There are many small and large challenges at Hanford, but to give a few big examples. First, the most dangerous of Hanford's waste, often referred to as high-level waste, is stored in 177 underground tanks. Each tank is about the size of a 4-story apartment building. All are well past their engineered design life, which has led to over 1 million gallons of waste leaking into the soil and new tanks having to be built. Each tank holds a largely unknown cocktail of chemicals, which includes plutonium. And plutonium has a half-life of over 24,000 years, which means it's dangerously radioactive for hundreds of thousands of years. So the big challenge here, how do we treat the waste and store it properly for hundreds of thousands of years? Second, ultimately, Hanford leadership has a history and pattern of retaliating against those who speak up when they see a problem. Most of the time, Hanford workers are just trying to do their job, but then they find themselves labeled as a whistleblower. Too often, Hanford has silenced whistleblowers through intimidation, transfers, and firings, regardless of the validity of their safety concerns that they raised. The big challenge here, how do we change Hanford's culture of secrecy to a culture that both encourages and promotes raising safety and environmental concerns? Third, given the complex and dangerous nature of Hanford's waste, off-site contamination is a big concern. There are 3 main ways off-site contamination occurs at Hanford: through the groundwater, when it becomes airborne, and accidents at or en route to off-site treatment facilities. Contamination from Hanford has been found in the car filters of workers. The Washington State Department of Health has found contamination miles off-site. And there has been a disturbing history of accidents, violations, and non-compliances during off-site waste treatment work at Perma-Fix Northwest, which is located in the city of Richland. These non-compliances, violation, and accidents raise serious concerns about whether Perma-Fix Northwest should still be allowed to continue to treat this dangerous waste. The big challenge here, how do we make sure that off-site contamination is prevented and mitigated? Fourth, the main challenge with worker safety is keeping workers away from chemicals and harmful radiation while doing the cleanup. For example, harmful chemical vapors have escaped the tanks and entered the breathing space of tank farm workers, sometimes without warning. Additionally, 42 Hanford workers inhaled or ingested radioactive contamination when gusts of winds picked up debris and carried radioactive contamination from the newly demolished plutonium finishing plant over a parking lot that was on-site and off-site. Worker exposures at Hanford result in a plethora of health issues, including respiratory problems, heart problems, neurological diseases, and cancers. I know some of these workers pictured in these photos, and I've talked to them about their health issues over several years. The big challenge here, how do we make sure that the workers doing this dangerous work do not get sick or injured while working at Hanford? As you can see, Hanford is a mess, a complex mess, and quite literally a hot mess. So, what are we doing about it? At Hanford Challenge, we're always watching and waiting with our toolbox to help. To answer what kind of tools we use, let's watch a short video about Hanford Challenge.
Everything growing up in Richland was about Hanford. Everybody's parents worked there in one level or another. It was really an idyllic place to live. It wasn't until I did some casework on whistleblowers that I started to realize the depth of the problems with the finances, the problems in the relationship between the government and the contractors.
It's a legacy that we were handed because of the Cold War. You know, this contamination that's out there, it's got a long lifespan, and we just can't forget it and walk away from it. It is going to be a problem until we clean it up and get rid of it.
I think people don't know that the Hanford cleanup is not successful. So a lot of people assume that since the production of plutonium has ended and that the site is in cleanup, that they don't have to worry about it or that it's not a concern.
It'd be really hard to overstate how important the cleanup at Hanford is. There's a lot at stake for workers and their health. There's a lot at stake for the community surrounding the Hanford site, and there's an awful lot at stake for our environment.
Whistleblower is a word that some people take as a negative and some take as a positive. I became acquainted with Hanford Challenge through an unfortunate situation in which I became a whistleblower, and Hanford Challenge was there to help me through that long, arduous process.
I worked as an instrument tech at Hanford for 34 years, mainly in the tank farms, and that was where I was exposed to gas vapors. The doctors at Hanford told me very little of what I may have been exposed to.
Workers are on the front lines of the cleanup. They see when it's going right and when it's not going so well, when laws are being broken, when safety issues are surfacing. We don't want to see what happened at Chernobyl or Fukushima, where there's a big release of these radioactive contaminants. I mean, if that were to happen, it would make the whole area around here uninhabitable for centuries. So that's the value of these insiders. They're a window into the site that we don't otherwise have.
They kept reiterating it was safe, and if he was ill, he was ill because of something else and not work.
And the company would not volunteer any help at all. Hanford Challenge was there to navigate through the maze of paperwork and people that would be there to help me.
We're here for House Bill 1723. We know that worker safety at Hanford is a top priority of our state.
Hanford Challenge played a key role in partnering with the state of Washington in achieving better standards of protections for workers at the Hanford site. They're a watchdog. That's the way I think of it. It's an organization that wakes up, the people there wake up every morning, they're thinking about one thing: Hanford, the workers, and the cleanup. I've got a lot on my plate, right? I depend on organizations like Hanford Challenge who are watching this all the time.
Hanford Challenge made me realize that yes, even though you are alone, you still have people in your corner. You're not going to find anybody that has more knowledge of Hanford, of the chemicals, of the vapors, of the radioactive situations, of what's going on than the Hanford Challenge.
I think what stood out for us with Hanford Challenge is that they're an organization that fights for the workers, but also they're an organization that, one of the only organizations that I know that is working on really preventing an environmental disaster from happening.
I don't think this fight is over.
No, I don't either.
I will tell you, Hanford has all the resources. They use taxpayers' money to fight us. They have endless pocket money to fight us.
You know, the public not only needs to know, but they have a right to know. These are our dollars, our environment, our workers. These are all such important aspects of living in the Northwest and being a citizen of this country. And yeah, it's time to hold them accountable. And that's what Hanford Challenge is here to do.
By keeping the pressure on that these are serious concerns, these are legitimate safety problems, these are serious health problems, I think it makes them toe the line and do things the right way.
Every single day, Hanford Challenge is looking out for that workforce, they're looking out for the taxpayer, they're looking out for the environment. That's all they do. And that matters because no one else is doing it. And I'm glad they're here, and I hope they're here for a long time.
So, At Hanford Challenge, it is our mission to create a future at Hanford Nuclear Site that secures human health and safety, advances accountability, and promotes a sustainable environmental legacy. We do this through consistent advocacy, outreach, and education. Excuse me. We aspire to lead and participate in collaborative problem solving with current and former Hanford workers, fellow advocates, stakeholders, and the public. We encourage you to join our mission today at hanfordchallenge.org. And please act now to protect our water, our wildlife, and our way of life, as we all live downriver from Hanford. And together, we can change Hanford's toxic legacy. Thank you for listening. Now it's time to hear from Shannon.
Thank you so much. I just want to reiterate, I know we just watched this video, but I just want to reiterate from a personal perspective, Hanford Challenge has been really essential form of support and resources for me as a scholar, both when I was a student and now that I'm a faculty member at UW. So I'm really just super grateful and excited that we get to do this talk together collaboratively today so that you all are introduced to this organization, and hopefully you can kind of reach out to them and make them a resource for you in your own studies or activism. So there's a lot of events that go on throughout the year. And yeah, like I said, I started doing this work when I was 23 as a student. I'm now 43, and I've been working with Hanford Challenge basically that whole time. So it's a really fantastic organization. So I'm going to talk about some questions and ideas that I've been following around for those 20 years and that I wrote about in this book. I heard that a couple of you are reading this for class, which is really, I'm incredibly grateful and excited about that. So I'm going to just sort of, maybe some of that will be familiar to you if you've read the book, but I'm just going to talk about some central questions that I'm still trying to work through as a scholar and an activist who's engaged at the Hanford site. I also want to say that just to situate myself a little bit, I'm coming to this project and this research as the granddaughter of someone who used to work at the Hanford site. He was a heavy equipment operator who built roads. He wasn't a scientist or anything, he was a laborer, and it was a temporary job, but still. He also helped to build the dams on the Columbia River, so again, as a laborer. And so I want to be explicit that like my heritage connection to this site is as one of a settler colonial process that actually made the Hanford site possible. Like the dams that provided the power to the Hanford site are something that my family helped to build. So when I'm thinking about a justice-oriented approach to the cleanup, I'm never thinking of myself as outside of that like historical legacy that made the bomb possible. I'm also thinking about this as, again, as I write about in the book, someone who's had cancer. While I was a student, my entire family got cancer, and my parents both died of it. We were all very young. My sister's cancer came back, and she beat it the second time as well. But so when I'm thinking about and talking about cancer, and contamination, exposure, the environment, I'm also thinking about it from the perspective of someone who's been sick and almost died, and who wonders where that cancer came from. You know, when your whole family gets cancer young and half of them die, you spend a lot of time wondering why and feeling the frustration of not being able to identify a cause. So those are questions that I'm also working through in writing this book and in my own research. And then another perspective is, as Anthony mentioned, I was on the Hanford Advisory Board for 10 years, which is a stakeholder body of groups that come together and write policy advice for the EPA, Department of Energy, and Department of Ecology that enact the cleanup, do the cleanup, and regulate the people who are doing the cleanup. So I had a decade of being in these spaces, thinking about these really complex social scientific problems, and having a lot of questions about their very definitional and foundational meanings that went on to sort of inform this book that I wrote. So I'm thinking about these questions from a number of different ways. But I just want to start with a story that has been really central to both my research and my activism at the Hanford site, which is this broad story that we tell about the Hanford site, that there's a contaminated place, it's hazardous to human health and the environment, and we need to clean it up. This is a story that you could say we tell about many different contaminated places, and it's one that almost feels quite simple and easy to understand. What I want to invite us to do is to break the story down a little bit and consider its parts in order to think critically about how it's situated in history and power. I want to make sure that we're not taking cleanup for granted as a known category that everyone agrees upon, and that we allow ourselves the time to think about the very definitional, the very meaning-making we make around complex sites like the Hanford site. So like I said, I've been telling the story for 20 years, since I was 23. I first started at Hanford going door to door as part of a political campaign about Hanford's waste. So I literally told a version of the story many thousands of times when I first learned about Hanford. And over the years, I've grown increasingly uncomfortable with the story, even as it's like in my heart, it's part of my identity to tell a story about cleanup. I'm uncomfortable about this story because it's not enough. It doesn't, at least on the surface level, acknowledge the history and power that I think we need to think more critically about in order to do a better job of cleaning up places like Hanford. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. So a couple of really basic things about that story that aren't enough are the fact that Hanford will never be cleaned up, if by clean we mean free of its waste. In fact, when the Hanford site is considered officially clean according to current standards the agencies are enacting, most of the waste will remain on the site. And it will remain there for what according to federal law, says is a reasonable amount of time, which, depending on which agency, ranges from 1,000 to 10,000 years. This doesn't represent the lifetime of the waste. The waste in some waste forms will last for less than this. Some will last for much, much more than this. So it's sort of just an agreed upon amount of time that gets considered reasonable. Okay, second, cleanup as containment does not necessarily even mean building barriers around the waste or separating it from the environment. In fact, much of the cleanup will be achieved through what are known as institutional controls. So institutional controls are things like fences, keep out signs, and land use regulations that sort of control what kinds of activities may occur on site. So for example, if you were to build a garden on the Hanford site and eat from it, you'll be more likely to get cancer from exposure to residual contamination than if the land use was for hiking. So you could manage exposure through what kinds of activities will be allowed to happen on the site. Third, and most importantly, is that clean does not necessarily mean uncontaminated in US environmental policy. Instead, according to Superfund and other toxics policies, clean is defined by a risk of cancer that has been achieved through cleanup. So I'll talk about that a little bit more later. But what I want to emphasize is that clean is not defined by the absence of waste. Instead, it's defined by the relationship between waste and the human body. And so cleanup kind of titrates exposure with human activity in order to achieve what's known as like a reasonable cancer rate, a reasonable amount of cancer risk. And that is a very interesting thing to say. It's something that requires us to think about historically and with an attention to power. And again, as someone who was dealing with cancer, either my parents or my own or my sister's, the whole time I was doing this research, I was really curious about, in my own policy work, trying to achieve a reasonable cancer risk rate and how that became the definition of clean and safe. It's interesting, right? So investigating this connection between safety and reasonable harm, how that came to be, became really essential to sort of my own reasoning and thinking about the Hanford site. And that's a lot about what I write about in the book. So again, this really basic and important and essential story has so many layers to it that in order to enact a justice-oriented approach to cleanup, we need to think about more carefully. So for example, if we're to say this is a contaminated place, what do we mean by contaminated? How should we understand this consequential category in a world that's saturated with industrial carcinogens and structural inequalities that amplify the effects of those carcinogens? What are the situated histories that have produced both the materials themselves and their entangled forms of reckoning? It's hazardous to human health and the environment. What do we mean by hazardous? And for that matter, health on an unevenly contaminated planet? What specific bodies, environments, and rationalities have come to define those terms, and what is it like to live their definitions? and we need to clean it up. What do we mean by cleanup? And how is that meaning informed by our answers to the preceding questions about contamination, health, and hazard? In other words, how does remediation reflect the powerful social relations of contamination, health, and hazard? So these are the framing questions and contradictions that I'm really interested in and that I want our conversations about cleanup to center. Okay, so in order to do that, I just want to step back and think about what it means to think about atomic weapons or the bomb. We often say the bomb, right, in singular, as if it is like one discrete, simple entity. When in fact, of course, the bomb exists at more moments than the moment of impact, even though we're, as a culture in the United States, been trained to really imagine it in this really particular shape, in a mushroom cloud shape, right? This is no accident. In fact, there was a full campaign in the United States to basically perform nuclear explosions for the American public and to sculpt their reaction to the mushroom cloud and the dangers that these weapons presented. That was in part a geopolitical project, right? In order for the bombs to be successful, they should never be used, but you should be really afraid of them. So if you're using them, you're failing. Using them in war, I said, they've been exploded a ton of times. We'll talk about that in a second. But you need to be very, very afraid of this technology in order for it to be a deterrent. But you can't be so afraid that you set off a panic that undermines the safety and security of the United States. There's a very fine psycho-social line that is being walked with these weapons. And this is at the Hanford site. This is some pictures I took of Richland High School. At the high school in the city, there's actually mushroom clouds all over it's not the mascot, but the representation of the mascot is a mushroom cloud. So even around town, you see mushroom clouds just sort of around the city a lot. It's really interesting. If you're not from the area, it feels very striking. If you're from there, it feels not striking at all. And so again, that relationship between the mushroom cloud and everyday life is one that I want to look closely at. And even if I wasn't born during the Cold War, I was born in 1980. I was born during the Cold War in 1980. I wasn't born during the period where we were doing duck and cover drills. Even if you weren't alive during the time where nuclear tests were being televised on TV, we still watch this. We're still sort of performing this in our own consumption of movies and TV, right? Even if you weren't alive when this was happening, you've still seen it a bunch and experienced it. So it's not ended. And part of the message during this time, again, was how to understand safety through deadly technology. That's a contradiction that we had to learn to live with. And so, again, during the 1950s and 60s, there was a lot of work that went on. There was actually a whole office called the Office of Civil Defense that went on to try and again, make the American public and the world very afraid of these technologies, but also to tell them at the same time, you can survive this. We could explode the whole world, but you could survive it also. Inhabit that contradiction. Make it central to your understanding of your safety and security according to this geopolitical regime. And like I said, there was actually televised tests on TV. There one in particular called Operation Q, where an entire city was built and then exploded and televised, narrated by Joan Collins, in order for the American public to see what it would be like for a US city to be completely exploded. And actually, in fact, these mannequins, companies actually signed up to put their clothes on the mannequins. There was a lot of branding that happened associated with this event, and the mannequins after the explosion were actually saved and brought to the hospital and then went on a multi-city tour across the United States in their burned clothing. So again, there's this strange thing where the danger is inside of the safety, and that becomes a contradiction that everyone needed to learn to live with. And in order to live with it, part of the messaging was, very explicitly from the federal government, learn to manage your panic. That your panic is more dangerous than the bomb. And that individually becomes part of your responsibility as a citizen of the United States. Part of that was narrated through building fallout shelters. There's a lot for a time of emphasis on building your individual family fallout shelter. imagining that as a way to survive this technology were a city to be, your city to be exploded. There were studies by the University of Georgia where people volunteered to go live in a fallout shelter in groups for long periods of time, up to a month, just to see psychologically what happened to people. But again, the idea was to teach fear while normalizing crisis. Again, that's a feeling that we are kind of aware of in this current day. I think this is broadly more applicable than just the, atomic weaponry, but it was a new framing during the Cold War that has gone on to inform our understandings of other sort of broad sociopolitical realities. But here's a poster from that time. After total war can come total living. That tells you so much about the strange project of security through weapons that was being sort of imagined and enacted during this time. The idea is to be afraid but not panic, to be prepared and to be disciplined, according to these terms. And so here are a few just really important contradictions I want to make explicit that are associated with this. One is the idea that avoiding atomic war meant actively preparing to achieve it, developing massive industrial economies, building production facilities in almost every state, and contaminating vast areas of land. And that in order to prevent foreign attack on American soil, the federal government would need to perform its domestic equivalent. So by the end of the Cold War, the US had atomic bombed itself more than 900 times in the name of its own protection, and televised it sometimes. And third, that nuclear safety could coexist with nuclear risk, that radiation protection could be defined by reasonable exposure. So lastly, the other thing that's going on at this time is not only that you're not only imagining the mushroom cloud, there was also a lot, increasingly so in the 1950s, of emphasis on fallout. Fallout was a new idea during the early Cold War because before atomic weapons testing, the scientific community literally didn't know that you could contaminate the entire planet from one spot. In fact, they didn't think you could. And it was only because of atomic tests and actually literally following the radioactive signature of these particles from tests around the planet that we learned a lot about atmospheric and oceanic circulation. It was just not known before that was possible. So it was a surprise to scientists who were often accidentally finding radioactive materials in places that they didn't expect to find it. And during this time, the scientific community basically was highly funded to go around the world and test just every single thing that they could come up with to see if it had fallout in it, and it did. So part of my research was in the archives where I read so many studies of people looking for fallout around the world, and it almost was a little bit comical or darkly comical. Just the things that they were testing. They tested polar bear hair. They sent scientists in the middle of the Amazon to test three-toed sloths. They tested dandelions on the side of the road in New York. They tested hamburgers in New Mexico. They tested everything, dust everywhere, milk everywhere, like raindrops everywhere, and it was everywhere. There was no outside to this contamination. Everywhere, everywhere, everywhere. And that was a very frightening and new idea to try and figure out. Here's a couple more pictures. This is of fallout in rain, fallout in milk, fallout in bones of humans, fallout in people who donated their teeth. It's called the Baby Tooth Survey in St. Louis. It was inside of us. Again, like our bodies, our children, our beings were not outside of atomic fallout. And as you can guess, people were wondering if that was going to be a big problem. And the problem of trying to regulate a contamination that was everywhere was also a new project to try and figure out. So in the mid-1950s, the National Academy of Sciences convened a series of committees to try and understand how to live with contamination that was already everywhere, including inside of our own bodies. And again, this was like a new regulatory premise. If you don't have an outside contamination, how do you regulate it? And how do you make sense of it? And one of the main things that came out of that, like the report for that series of committees, was associated with the genetics committee for this organization, the Bear Report, or the National Academy of Sciences project. They basically, from a genetics perspective, there was no safe amount of radiation. There was always the possibility or the risk of genetic mutation, and at the scale of humanity, that meant likely many millions of people would be born with mutations or die of mutations. And if that is the case, how could you justify the use of this technology when that technology was also central to your imagination of geopolitical security and safety? And when I was reading this report in the archive, one sentence from it just really stood out to me and became sort of central to my understanding of the contradiction. And that was from the Genetics Committee. They suggested a certain amount of radiation that would be okay. And they're saying, like, look, it's not harmless, mind you, but it's a reasonable amount. And these words were underlined in the report. It's not my underlining. But this idea of not harmless, mind you, but reasonable, these 6 words just rung in my ears, and I just kind of carried them around and became very curious about how you make a policy based on that when that wasn't the political framing for toxics policy before. Part of that had to do with a regulatory idea called permissible dose, which is an amount of exposure associated with radiation that imagines a possibility of injury manifestable during the lifetime of an individual or in subsequent generations. However, the probability of that occurrence should be so low that the risk would be readily acceptable to the average individual. So this idea of readily acceptable risk becomes really central to the meaning and making of clean in places like Hanford. Part of that had to do with an emphasis on economics during the period of time, especially during the Cold War. Economics kind of like had a heyday. And the idea that everything should be determined by cost-benefit analysis. And that cost-benefit analysis, that explicit sort of risk of cancer death, should become the barometer by which we determine whether something is clean and safe. So under Superfund, that risk of cancer is a 1 in 10,000 rate of death. So a 1 in 10,000 chance. I'm mixing up rate and risk. I recognize that I'm doing that. We can talk about it later. A 1 in 10,000 chance of developing cancer from exposure to residual contamination on site is the basis for action in Superfund. So again, like if we imagine a 1 in 10,000, a society in which 1 in 10,000 people die of cancer from exposure to radiation or residual radiation on site, residual contamination on site. It's not just radiation, it's also chemical exposure. How should we think about that as a project? Sometimes when I'm in class, I have my students sort of come up with a rate that they think, a risk rate that they think would be good or reasonable. My point isn't necessarily to give you a number, but to invite you to think about the fact that that number has been made and that number informs an understanding of reasonableness in our environmental policy, especially when most people don't understand that clean is not the absence of waste, right? Clean is a cancer risk rate. So part of what happens there, and I'm almost done, part of what happens there is that the people who are dying in this imagination, this 1 in 10,000 imagination, are statistical people. You'll never be able to tell, at least according to our current understandings, and also our landscape in which we're living in, so many things are contaminating us all the time. You'll almost never be able to figure out when one exposure caused one cancer. Basically, you are by necessity relying on statistical people to tell you whether you've reached that 1 in 10,000 cancer rate. So Lisa Heinzerling, a former EPA policy advisor, writes a lot about the rights of statistical people in a way that I find really interesting. She writes that a primary feature of the statistical person is that she is unidentified. She is no one's sister or daughter or mother. Indeed, in one conception, she is not a person at all, but rather only a collection of risks. She also writes that there are no identified lives in US environmental law. They are all statistical lives. They are statistical lives before we step in to protect them, and they are statistical lives after they are helped or after they are hurt. Again, I think my positionality as someone who's had a lot of cancer in their family, unending amounts it feels, it is striking to me that the people that we are protecting and hurting in these imaginations are not visible. They're abstract by their very nature. Again, models are necessary to understanding waste that lasts beyond humanity and the nation, and we need to remember that humans also exist and that in that imagination, some people will die. We just won't know who it is. And thus, like, how can we think about vulnerability? How can we think about power in the models and the imaginations that we use to determine this acceptable risk rate, this reasonable harm rate. And finally, I want to just say that thinking about the body at risk as a waste management tool is unique to this moment in history. It is a practice that was born out of nuclear weapons development and that went on to inform broader non-nuclear environmental and toxics policies in the United States. So the bomb, these imaginations of reasonable harm, the contradictions of technologies of death making you safer, actually were born of the nuclear project and went on to become a logic or a rationality that informed environmental policy more broadly. And that's something that I think is really important to remember as well. So as we're thinking about the body at risk, that statistical person, one of the projects in the book that I write about a lot, and a project for me as an activist, is to think about actually let's de-abstract a little bit and think about whose body, whose life, and whose future is being imagined for the Hanford site, because that really changes the kind of cancer rate that you'll get to with the cleanup. So for example, again, if you imagine that it's just going to be hikers on the Hanford site forever, the cancer risk is going to be a lot lower than if you imagine that, for example, the tribes that have treaty rights to be in relation with the site, to gather traditional foods and medicines on the site, to use the site for spiritual ceremonies, a much more interactive relationship with the land, with exposure, much more higher exposure potential, the cancer rate will be much higher. And so who you imagine for the future of the Hanford site, whose life you're making possible, whose statistical life you're making possible, really changes the material cleanup that happens on the ground, or the requirements for how much material cleanup needs to happen on the ground. So again, it's a question of power, it's a question of remembering who is at greatest risk from these exposures, and adapting and thinking about how to enact cleanup with that sort of attention to history and power in place. So again, I bring this story back up again just to remind us, think about all the layers that go into advocacy for something like cleanup at the Hanford site. That's one thing I want to talk about. So we have a couple questions we wanted to ask each other, and then we'll open it up to the floor. We'll just be quick, but yeah, sounds good. Does this work? Nope. Test. Okay, cool. So because we have someone with an expert in tribal law, a tribal court judge, I wanted to ask Brittany to talk about the role that tribal law and treaty rights play in cleanup at the Hanford site.
All right, so to preface this, I do not speak for any tribes, but at Hanford, since it is a federal site, tribal law does not apply on site. However, tribes have two different legal tools that they can use to impact and influence Hanford and decisions made at Hanford. Those are their treaty rights and tribal consultation. For treaty rights, those are individual to each specific tribe as a tribal government. And so they have individual treaties with the federal government that specify their rights. There are some risks to the tribes trying to enforce their treaty rights. So we have a history in federal Indian law where tribes try to enforce their treaty rights and they run into the government saying, that's not our interpretation of your right. And then there's a challenge if they try to pursue enforcing it regardless. If this treaty right gets challenged in court, the judge ultimately can shave away at those rights. They can limit the rights. They can change the rights based on their interpretation of what the treaty rights are. And so it's a risk for the tribes to bring their treaty rights forward for that reason. The tribes also, this is their tool. It's their tool in their toolbox, so they use it as they see fit, each individual tribe. The other option is tribal consultation. And the big problem we see with this is that it's often used as a checkbox. And what I mean by that is Hanford will make decisions. They'll take months and months and months to work with multiple agencies, and they'll have this giant plan, hundreds and hundreds of pages. They release it for tribal consultation and public comment. Are they actually going to change anything in that plan that took them so long to make? Maybe. But what they should have done was involve the tribes from the get-go so that they could produce meaningful contributions to the plan. So those are their two ways to get involved. They also can get involved more informally by making their own watchdog groups. So several tribes have environmental restoration waste management groups. So you can look into those if you want more information on that. All right. So next, a question for Shannon. What is it like to teach about Hanford in your classes? And what have you learned from your
My messy handwriting.
I can't read it.
Conversation.
Oh, what have you learned with conversations with your students over the years?
So I wanted to just bring this up so that I could say, like, as most of you are students, that most of my interaction around Hanford has been either in this policy spaces or with students. I've been learning so much about Hanford through my interactions with students over the last, almost 20 years. I've been a teacher for 17 years. And some of the things that I noticed the most are, first of all, because I've been mostly teaching in Western Washington, not in Eastern Washington, almost none of my students have ever heard of the Hanford site. I'm just kind of curious of show of hands, like before you started reading about it or in your own work, who had heard of the Hanford site? Oh my gosh, that's so great. That's like such a big difference. It's wonderful. I have not found that to be the case over the years, so this feels really hopeful to me that so many people had heard of it. So the like beginnings are just sort of a lot of surprise that the Hanford site even exists, that Washington State is home to 2/3 of the U.S. high-level nuclear waste inventory, that we're actually really, really, really central to the production of the bomb. It's just not an imagination that we have with the state. So starting there is something that has been really interesting to me. But what I've learned from students is that thinking about the Hanford site in a grounded and complex way means actually like going into the policies and thinking about, okay, the project has been to imagine ourselves in the non-abstract statistical terms that allow us to center ethical commitments and imaginations of the site with a justice framework. It's like to keep de-abstracting from a system that depends upon abstraction in order to function. Students are really good at that, I've found. We do that with creative writing, sci-fi writing in my classes. We do it with like close policy analysis as well. But like, again, like bringing ourselves into the framing rather than imagining ourselves as outside of it, and learning to not love, but kind of learning to love paradox, and getting used to living in contradiction has been an important project as well. I often tell my students, if you are feeling uncomfortable that you don't have black and white categories, you're probably doing it right. That's what it feels like to do environmental work. It doesn't mean you don't have ethical commitments. You do. You can feel very clear about your ethical commitments, but actually enacting a policy on the ground is challenging. And being good at inhabiting that contradictory feeling is part of it. So, yeah. Okay, I wanted to ask what brought you to Hanford in the first place, and what are like some goals for you in doing this work?
So I was one that didn't know about Hanford until my final semester of law school. I'm originally from Southeast Alaska, and we consider Washington our home away from home. All your sports teams are our sports teams. We vacation to Seattle as our place to shop. So it was very weird to me that I didn't learn about Hanford in history at all, and didn't learn about it until I was in such high education, my last year of law school. But as an Indigenous Islander, I've always been passionate about environmental law and Indian law, and so that last semester of law school, I was looking for an externship that hit both of those. And Hanford Challenge was available for an externship. I did an interview and immediately knew I wanted to work for this place. During my first semester with Hanford Challenge, I did so much eye-opening and inspiring work. Literally the first week I was there, I got to write testimony for the executive director at the time and founder of Hanford Challenge, Tom Carpenter. I wrote his testimony that he testified before Congress, or not Congress, but the committee that was working on the bill, the presumption of illness bill that was passed. I also got to go down to Olympia with him and witness him testifying and meet a bunch of workers. I was there when they signed the bill into law. I got to go to Washington, D.C. with Alliance for Nuclear Accountability for their D.C. days, where we meet with congressional officials and other agency officials to advocate for Hanford. And I also was part of the Hanford Forum, which during COVID, unfortunately, went on the back burner and hasn't opened up again. But the Hanford Forum was a really important informal place to bring stakeholders together. And I actually met Shannon there. And all of these places, like I said, were eye-opening. All these experiences were inspiring. But they ultimately led me to one of my big goals working at Hanford Challenge, which is to get more people of the global majority, also known as people of color, at the table. I want more people like me with my experiences, tribal people, specifically tribal nations that are impacted. I want those people at the table. I want their voice to be heard. I want their comments to be meaningful and not just a checkbox. So, Shannon, what inspired you to work on Hanford issues, and what brought you to this topic, and what are some of your goals?
Okay, so I mentioned before I just started doing this work when I was 23 because I worked on a political campaign. It was for Washburg. I think it's called Environment Washington now, but I was going door to door working on this political campaign. And I'd never heard of Hanford before either, even though my grandfather worked there and my mom grew up 30 miles from the B reactor. I had never heard of it before. And I got to feel curious about the site after having conversations with people over and over for a summer, and then went on to graduate school and decided to study it, and yeah, just got really hooked. One of the reasons that I've stayed studying this topic beyond it being interesting and stayed working on it as an activist and advocate has been because of the people that I've met doing the work, both in the Tri-Cities and not in the Tri-Cities. But I got to do the DC days that Brittany talked about as well. I had to meet with congressional representatives. I've gotten to know workers at the Hanford site and become good friends with people who work at the Hanford site and have spent their career there, and have a lot of admiration for the people who are doing this work, even though we often don't share politics and nuclear politics. Learning to be in conversation with people that I don't agree with on all topics, but to feel like the human connections and to care about their kids and their health, and they care about mine, has been a really important learning experience for me as someone doing environmental policy work, doing policy work like across politics. Yeah, and I think just another thing that I really care about is that cleanup center those that are most vulnerable from exposure. And in fact, I want that to be definitional to clean. Again, I want to de-abstract the conversation from the narratives that we have to work with around current narratives we have to work with around nuclear things. So I think we can open it up for questions to you all now, too. We have some time.
Can we first thank you so much for the...
Yeah, we can, if people are comfy. Are people comfy raising your hands? Okay.
What you think the implications of the successes or failures that happen at the Hanford site have for the rest of the country in terms of environmental policy and community involvement? Like, how does it, what are its larger implications?
I mean, it definitely has larger implications. We work with Alliance for Nuclear Accountability because that is a larger group that talks about sites all over the nation, right? And so we work together to try and formulate a cohesive message and advocate for both sides. What we've found mostly that we focus on that kind of impacts policy overall is funding. Funding has been a big issue. We constantly need more and more money than they're able to give. Constantly stakeholders like Shannon was talking about, people that don't necessarily agree on things, agree that we need more money to be able to do this work. And we constantly get a good amount of funding, $2.3 billion this last year, but that's not nearly enough. Projections ask for 3.5 to 10 billion to be able to finish in 70 years, but per year. And so it's a lot of money. And each year we're advocating for more funding to go to Hanford. And that obviously impacts funding that goes to other sites as well. So that's one way Hanford Challenge is involved in that. It doesn't answer your question completely, but that's one example. In the back. Oh, sorry.
I'll just say also that Hanford is, as the best funded site, not funded enough, but best funded site, it's a center of scientific development around nuclear waste technologies too. So discoveries for how to manage waste happen at the Hanford site and then are actually like distributed across the nuclear complex. Hanford workers have often worked at other sites across the complex. So they'll work at Savannah River site, they'll work at the Idaho National Lab, then they'll come to the Hanford site. So it's in direct conversation, not only across the site, but across the world. So Hanford scientists also inform cleanup stuff at Fukushima, places like that too, Chernobyl. These nuclear scientists are in a broader scientific community around cleanup and nuclear things. So yeah, there's a lot of connection. I agree with that.
Curious about, can you hear me okay? Okay, that's my first curiosity. The second was around, Shannon, you keep mentioning like kind of de-abstract, and we were talking a lot about the imaginary space and decoupling our thoughts from the, settler colonial mindset and narrative and paradigm, Free Palestine, by the way. It's like all of that is really interconnected, so thank you. But regarding that imaginative space and the abstract, what schools of thought or what kind of thought leaders are you following or inspired by that's kind of helping shape your imagination to guide other imaginations to kind of decouple the way that you're talking about?
I mean, so many.
Okay.
I consider myself a feminist scholar, so I'm really interested in scholarship that is emphasize relationality, that looks beyond sort of more normative understandings of the body, of relationships. I'm really interested in the body as a practice rather than the body as just a discrete material thing. So thinking about like Donna Haraway, for example, is a feminist STS scholar that talks about how the body does not end at the skin, but that in fact it is informed by these historical, colonial, interrelational dynamics, power structures, and that like we can't actually understand the power of the body without thinking about it in relation. So that's those kinds of framings are the ones that I find closest to my heart and make the most sense to me. Yeah.
What was that name?
Donna Haraway, but that's just one of many amazing, feminist science technology scholars. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
This is kind of in the same vein, but how do you there's like a layer of absurdity to this scholarship, to just the contradictions of we bombed ourselves 900 times before, that is absurd, and so how are you not replicating or reproducing this absurdity in your imagination or in your life? It's kind of like Jamie's question. So maybe you've already answered it, but.
I mean, I have some, and then I'll let you too. So I think that there is both, yes to the absurdity thing. It's hard to hold it, right? And then also there's a way that absurdity can be a space or possibility of imagining otherwise, because absurdity is necessarily sort of outside of a normative understanding of reality, right? So like the nuclear spaces from a scholarly theoretical perspective actually does both. It absorbs and enacts this abstraction or, absurdity, but then it also like is more than we can imagine. So it allows us to kind of inhabit the power dynamics that exist outside of normative structures too. And in the book, this is a plug for the book, the conclusion of the book talks about this opera that I went to go watch inside of the B reactor, where this nuclear worker who'd worked at the Hanford site for 30 years takes the workers' dreams and puts them to music. And the dreams, dreams by their very nature are absurdist oftentimes. And what she did, it was really interesting. What she did was that she recorded the dreams of workers as she was interviewing them to figure out where waste had been buried, because there's not very good record keeping historically at the Hanford site. So she had to go find workers who'd worked at Hanford and said, like, where was it buried? And as people are telling her these things, they also sort of like, oh, I had a crazy dream last night. So she recorded their dreams and she recorded their just everyday life memories of the site. And then she didn't tell you in the opera which was a dream and which was reality. And she did that on purpose because working at Hanford is very dreamlike in the surreality of it, but also because she's trying to like imagine another way of being and imagining outside of the normative, these weird structural normative experiences. When I say normative, I mean sort of like the central power dynamic that has sort of like sculpted most imaginations. So yeah, I guess that's a weird way of saying, but you know what I mean? Yeah, okay. Okay, do you have anything to add about that? No, okay.
In the back?
I have two questions. The first one was for you, Brittany. So you had mentioned that if anything happens really bad at Hanford, that there were 3 states that would be majorly impacted. Did you know what 3 states those were?
Yeah, so it's located in eastern Washington, and it borders Idaho and Oregon. So those 3 states, and then the 3 tribal nations would be Yakima, which is in Washington, Umatilla in Oregon, and Nez Perce in Idaho.
The second question was, Shannon, the study you mentioned under the university, I think it was like Georgia, where you talked about what happened to people when they were in a fallout shelter for a month. And I was really curious if you knew like what happened psychologically and how that impacted them, especially in current day politics where people are like, just build a shelter and doomsday prepping and all of that. How does that play into our current politics when it actually might be psychologically damaging to be locked up like that, in a sense?
Okay, so if you all have like an open project for a class or something, go look up these studies. I didn't get to include them in the book just because I ran out of time, but they're so interesting. They actually do an hour by hour breakdown of like what people are doing, what they're experiencing. And what's so fascinating about it is the ways that like the project itself was sort of to prove that this rationality for how we'll be safe is possible. But they also, so legit, this is important, like, or impressive that they did this. They literally just gave them a piece of cardboard for their bed. They got to eat like a couple crackers a day. They all shared like a container to poop in, like, in the room. It was hard. And in one of the studies, in the first like 4 hours, this 10-year-old kid was like so annoying to everyone that the project was going to be ruined if they didn't get him out of there right now. And so they just like let him leave because they were like, I am definitely going to kill this kid. So like there was sort of this like imagination of like it's possible, and then also if something bad was happening, they'd be like, never mind, no, fake this kid out. So and then like another woman kind of realized partway through one of the studies that she was pregnant, so they let her leave. So there was sort of a way that like it was both a real experiment and also like they breached the boundaries when they needed to. So what you learn is what people can make it through, but also like, did you really learn that? It's really interesting to see like what they did to pass their time, because they didn't give them like playing cards or anything like that. By the end, they like were organizing like fake weddings for different participants just to like have something to do. It's really interesting. I really recommend looking them up. Yeah, University of Georgia Studies.
I think that's so interesting how you were talking about for part of the lecture, and now like I do think there is kind of a difference, right? I mean, it might appear like surreal in a sense, but that there was such like a purposeful constructing of relations between people and, you know, the bomb, almost like trying to normalize it and make it sort of like the spectacular thing with like entertainment value, right? I was wondering if you would like are planning on doing any work, like kind of on that in the future, or and also could you remind us of the name of the person who was recording the dreams of the Hanford workers?
Yeah. Her name is Nancy Welliver, Welliver. You can go watch, if you Google her, go on YouTube. A couple of those songs that are recorded inside the B Reactor, you can watch them on YouTube along with some transcripts so you can see the words. So yeah, but again, she was an environmental scientist at Hanford for more than 30 years. Yeah. Sorry, I missed the other question. I missed the other part of it.
I was wondering if you were going to do any more work kind of talking about the purposeful like way that the relation to the bomb and the American public was kind of engineered.
There's just this endless opportunities. I don't know if I will or not. I'm on sabbatical this year, and I'm working on another project that's not nuclear related, actually. But I have been in conversation with a bunch of artists and poets. I think it lends itself to the humanities approaches to thinking about, like, for example, I wrote an article many years ago when I was in graduate school called Becoming Jane, which is about like the statistical person at the center of one of these exposure scenarios and how she lives her life. And I was in conversation with a filmmaker who wanted to like have someone be Jane in a dance that like, so I think that there's lots of ways to approach it. I don't know if I will do that myself or not, but I invite you all to take it up. Yeah.
And if you do, I invite you all to come to Hanford Challenge for us to support you.
Agree. Yes.
Have the reasonable exposure rates moved at all since global and national cancer rates continue to increase? Are we allowed to get zapped with more radiation now?
So the rate, or the risk rate in Superfund, for example, do you mean like the 1 in 10,000? Yes. No, that still remains the sort of basis for action under Superfund. Again, like one of the things that make it really challenging is that, like, again, it's not just radiation that we're being exposed to. We're being exposed to things all the time. Babies are born with how many 300 chemicals, I think the study was, in their cord blood. Before you're even born, you come in with lots of carcinogens. So it's very, very, very difficult to make that causal connection. And for me, that means being even more conservative in your modeling to account for the uncertainties and the like everywhere and always exposure that's happening. If you can't identify that direct causal link, be even more careful in your protections, I guess. Does that make sense? In other words, like, no, the reasonable amount has not changed. Yeah.
Has there been any indication thus far that nuclear waste has something to do with rising global temperatures? No? Okay.
On page 130, you said you wanted a future inhabited by more than statistical people. I feel that a lot of people buy into like a necessary evil mindset when it comes to the developments that happened at Hanford, without really understanding the scope of like nuclear structural violence. So we could just look at like seawall rights saying a miscarriage doesn't count as anything, or talking about kind of what happened to the workers or what happened downwind of like Richland. But I was wondering, do you think it would be possible for socially and more environmentally responsible parties to be involved in the development of future nuclear technology? Or do you think that's just kind of incompatible? Because to me it seems like it would be within the government's own best interest to have like lower cancer rates lower environmental impacts, like so they don't have to pay for these costly environmental cleanups. It would also improve their image and make it so it'd be more difficult to repeat history, but I just don't know how we would get there.
I hear you. So one of the things that has just been happening for me lately is, again, because of the frustration of the inability to, the requirement to establish cause before you can get compensation if you're a worker, for example. You have to go through this whole probability of causation assessment in order to establish whether or not you are eligible for compensation and medical benefits if you have cancer, if you have one of a particular list of cancers. What's happened at the Hanford site and across the nuclear complex is that, like, because establishing probability of causation is so problematic, there's so many uncertainties, the record keeping was poor. In the end, a lot of the sites have just established what are known as special exposure cohorts, where just if you worked at the site for the 180 days in these particular areas during a period of time, you'll just get compensation and medical care, because it's too hard to prove that causation. So basically what they've said is, like, we'll just give you the benefit of the doubt. If you're sick, we'll help you. And more broadly, I kind of, that's where I've been landing a little bit lately, is because there's so many contaminants, it's so hard to prove causation. Maybe like a radical act would just be to enact like socialized medicine, just to like give everybody health care. And like in a broader, not just the nuclear complex way, because I want to be bound by more than these like old school, in my opinion, like imaginations of cause and effect. I want to think more broadly about care and how we heal and clean and prevent illness, you know? So that's often where I've been landing lately.
I believe you said earlier that Hanford was, for the people behind Hanford, were actively trying to like silence people for speaking out about it. And I was wondering how that did that, and if so, how did that affect your book?
Oh, do you want to answer this? Because you work with whistleblowers.
Yes, so I did say that is a culture, a silence culture, keep the money flowing culture, don't speak about issues. And so that impacts a lot of whistleblowers, and that's work that I directly work on as an advocate for Hanford Challenge. I represent whistleblowers in federal court, and we try to do everything we can before getting to federal court. So we start day one. If a whistleblower has a problem, we ask them to call us before they complain about it on site, so that we can help them navigate who to complain to on site, make sure everything is recorded, documented, so we can go back to that in case there's any retaliation, any trying to silence, any pushing them into a different department or a different role, limiting their hours, things like that. And to pass it back to Shannon to talk about how it influenced your book.
Okay, and then I think we're out of time, right? Okay. So working with Hanford Challenge as a researcher, as both a graduate student and as a faculty member, I had the privilege of going to whistleblower intake meetings. So that's where workers are telling what's happening on site, what stories they're telling that can't be heard. And so the introduction to my book is called On Telling Impossible Stories. I mean that in this like broader sense of like how we imagine what's possible, whose future is possible, how cleanup is imagining a particular future, but also really practically at the Hanford site, whose stories can be heard and under what terms. For workers, sometimes that is just a really direct impossibility where you see something happening, something's happening to your body, and no one will hear you. And so you have to set the structural conditions to be heard, and Hanford Challenge does that work so critically. That was a huge influence on my book, was being in meeting after meeting with people who are telling a story that is being called impossible, and then finding ways to make that story hearable and what they're seeing as reasonable within a system that can only see it within a particular vision or lens, through a particular lens. Yeah. Oh, do you have more time? I thought we were at 12. Okay.
For a couple more? In the back.
Me? I was just going to ask, like speaking on impossibility, with all the politics surrounding land use and the amendable regulations, how could we move towards a future where there's a continued priority of remediation and containment on sites like Hanford?
I mean, that's what we're doing every day, right? We're watching. We're watching very closely. We have allies that are scientists and workers and former workers and influential people that are in the Tri-Cities that are our allies. Influential people like Bob Ferguson in our video. We try to collaborate with not only people who agree with us, but those who disagree, so that we can make that the reality. You have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I just add this, choosing a more protective land use means requiring more cleanup. So if you pick something that's not a wilderness area, you'll get more cleanup. A wilderness area is a place where humans do not live, by definition, land use wise. So even though wilderness area is a benefit for some things, it also means that less cleanup is required. And so sometimes this is called greenwashing, or thrifty environmentalism, it's also been called, where you can make the case for you want a nature preserve. It can also be a way to not have to dig up or move as much cleanup, or as much waste. So again, thinking about land use in a strategic way is really important. I think you're pointing to something key there.
I was wondering if you have an opinion on the use of nuclear technology as an energy source, and then also if you believe that our current storage techniques are adequate.
Hanford Challenge does not have an opinion on that yet.
Okay, got it. We have a long way to go to ensure safe long-term management of nuclear waste in the United States. We have yet to identify a permanent solution for long-term waste. The Nuclear Waste Policy Act requires that we establish a deep geological repository for waste, and that spot has yet to be identified. And a lot of the waste storage practices across the United States are pretty haphazard. They're often like site-based, what's going on at what site and another. For me, having worked on Hanford issues for 20 years, on the waste end of things, which is sort of the end of the part of nuclear energy that doesn't get discussed very much, it's really hard for me to get excited about those technologies. I'm not an expert in nuclear energy. The Hanford site produced weapons, not energy, and those are two different regulatory systems, actually. The Department of Energy does the weapons. Nuclear Regulatory Commission is more centering the energy. So I'm just not as well-versed in nuclear energy, but just for my own self, I spent too much time thinking about waste. I'd rather us put resources and energy into another technology. Again, not my expertise.
Sorry, another question. So in the last part of the book, you talk about how the Department of Energy is wanting to move towards using grouting as opposed to vitrification. From what I've looked at, I went on the DOE website and they just said the grouting is low cost and better for low active waste, and then the vitrification is for highly active waste. How do they even come to that determination as to what should be grouted and vitrified? How do they make that distinguishment?
There are legal definitions for high-level waste versus low-level waste. And so that was defined. However, there are attempts to reclassify waste for this grouting initiative, because waste was legally defined by where it came from, not necessarily what the chemicals are specifically. So for example, like I talked about the tanks, they're an unknown cocktail of chemicals. And so that is classified as high-level waste based on where it came from, not necessarily what's in each tank. And so there has been an initiative to try to relabel high-level waste by confirming what chemicals there are to try to make it meet the definition of low-level waste so that we can grout more of Hanford waste, which grouting is basically pouring cement on it and leaving it.
Yeah, for the Hanford Advisory Board, of which Hanford Challenge has been a part for more than a decade, this has been up for debate for a long time. What I tend to lean towards is the idea, there's a policy perspective of that the waste management or the high-level waste should be encased in what's known as either glass or as good as glass. So either vitrification, which creates glass, or something that's as good as glass. And grout is not as good as glass. If you think about like sort of the materiality of glass versus the materiality of grout, what's going to crumble and last, what's going to last longer than glass. They've actually done a bunch of studies about glass and how long we think of glass metaphorically as something quite fragile, but actually from the perspective of waste management, creating glass, it's less likely to leach, it's less likely to crumble, it actually lasts kind of a long time. Whereas grout crumbles, we've all been around cement, it crumbles eventually, so.
And I'd just like to add, Hanford Challenge is an as good as glass standpoint. Are there any other quick questions?
So I was realizing like throughout the course of the lecture that there's a lot of instances in which there's a lot of abstractions being made that kind of like impede progress on like with cleanup at the Hanford site, or like really effective progress, especially in that situation with grouting versus vitrification. I was wondering if there were some ways that you all, like as a like an ideal sort of in an ideal situation, how would you wish that kind of like waste management when it comes to nuclear waste would go, like how would that be managed? Yeah.
I guess there are several ideals. One is keeping everything on site. Off-site contamination is already a risk without trying to treat waste off-site. I talked about Perma-Fix Northwest in the city of Richland. They transfer the waste from the site on the public highways to Perma-Fix Northwest. So that en route, that's a dangerous route for the waste to be on a highway, right? And Perma-Fix Northwest is also located in a community really close to daycares, schools, places where people work. And a lot of the time people don't even know it's there. So one thing Hanford Challenge is really strong about is we want the waste to stay on site. We want to treat it on site. We want the VIT plant to work. We want it to be high-level waste to be treated as good as glass. Shannon, do you have some things to add?
I'm just repeating myself a little bit, but I want us to center the most vulnerable, the people who would be most vulnerable to the waste. I want us to imagine a future that is the most protective as possible, because again, there are so many uncertainties involved in modeling multimillennial waste management. Just be more careful. The National Academy of Sciences had another report that came out in the early 2000s that also that committee made the same case. Like, there are too many uncertainties, you need to be extra protective. Being extra protective is a reasonable act. And so that's usually my framing, is just like, if you can't have ultimate certainty, so let's imagine the future of the people who would be most exposed and go with that. It protects everyone then. That's usually my framing, yeah. Okay, out of time. Thank you so much.